Hello, my name is Elise or Sauce, and in 2022 I thru-hiked the CDT. I'm also a huge fan of financial transparency, so today I want to answer the question, how much does a thru-hike cost, by telling you exactly how much I spent on the CDT in 2022. Before I dive into it, I want to take a moment to say thank you for being here. I appreciate your support, and if you want to keep seeing content like this from me, go ahead and hit the like button or subscribe so I know to keep making more. As you may know, there are 5 states on the CDT, but today for this video, I'm dividing things up into 4 sections just to make it a little bit easier. New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming, and then combining Idaho and Montana because you're kind of on the border of those 2 for a while and logistically it's just easier that way. Then for each section, I broke everything up into 5 major spending categories. First section I'm going to be talking about is resupply. That's the food that we bought in town to eat in between on the next section of trail, and also sometimes I included in that groceries for while we were in town. Second is food and beverages in town. This is any money I spent going out to eat in town. So going out to dinner, going to a coffee shop, going to the bar. There were maybe a few more bar tabs in there than I'd like to mention. Shout out to Hole in the Wall and Rollins. But yeah, pretty self-explanatory. Third is lodging, what I paid to stay while I was in town, or sometimes I also camped. Fourth is gear replacement. This is any money I spent to replace gear while I was already on trail, so not including the gear that I bought beforehand. Fifth category is just miscellaneous, a catch-all for anything else, including ongoing expenses at home, which were very minimal by design. I know you just want the numbers, and I promise I will give them all to you, but bear with me while I go over some important context first. First of all, I spent over 2 years living well below my means and being very frugal saving for this thru-hike. I knew I wanted a good cushion to come back to, so I had about $13,000 saved before I left for this trail. Now, I know that might sound like a lot for some people, for others it might sound like a little, but just some context as to how I was able to save that. I do not have debt, I do not have kids, I do not have pets, and I also rent my housing. So I did not have any ongoing housing costs while I was on trail. My situation is obviously different and potentially a little more flexible than some. For example, if you have kids, if you have pets, if you have to continue paying a mortgage while you're on trail, things might look very different for you. I also hiked this trail with my fiance, which meant I always had someone built in to split lodging with, which is huge. We even sometimes split larger rooms with our whole trail family. And if that's something that you're interested in doing, there are usually hikers around who are willing to do the same. Everybody is kind of out there hoping to keep costs down. Another really important thing to know about my hiking style is I love my town days. I took 22 zeros on this trail, and that's just part of the thru-hike for me. And I knew that was something that I wanted to and was going to be spending my money on. So if you do not care as much about spending time in town, you could obviously make your hike cheaper that way as well. I kind of view my thru-hikes as hard-earned vacations, and while I definitely don't go totally over the top, I'm also not really denying myself of much of that in-town comfort. So just keep that in mind when we're going through my numbers. In this video, I'm going to be going over my on-trail total, but of course there are other costs that happen up front that do contribute to a huge portion of the cost of a thru-hike. I'm going to keep those costs separate from my on-trail total, but I am going to share them with you because I think they're pertinent to how much you're going to need to save overall for a thru-hike. One of my biggest concerns, and I knew costs before going into this thru-hike, was going to be insurance. Shout out to my fellow 26-year-olds who can no longer rely on their parents. I spent $674 for 6 months of catastrophic travel insurance through World Nomads. I also spent $451 for 6 months of car insurance before my hike. There's a lot of different things you can do with your car, but this is just what made the most logistical sense for me, was continuing to pay insurance, and I actually stored it at my parents' house. Finally, if I went out right now and bought all the gear that I carried with me on the CDT, I would spend $3,848. Now, that number is a lot higher than what I actually spent because I spent years accumulating this gear, shopping sales, shopping secondhand, etc., even doing work in exchange for some of my gear. So again, that total is a lot higher than it actually would be, but if you were to just go out and purchase my exact gear list, I wanted to give a number of what that might look like right now. So before I even stepped foot on trail, my thru-hike cost me roughly $4,973. It's not a commercial spaceflight, but it certainly isn't cheap either. So with that out of the way, let's dive into what my thru-hike cost on trail by state. First up is New Mexico. I went northbound in case you couldn't tell, and at a total of 777 miles with 10 town stops and 5 zeros, I spent $2,489.58. Spoiler alert, this was my most expensive state. Let's dive into some specifics so we can get an idea as to why. First of all, I'm counting the southern terminus as a town and also our return to New Mexico as a town. If you didn't know, the National Forest closed this year, so we had to skip about 150 miles in May, and then we went back to do those 150 miles in September. So obviously that became a little bit more expensive. I spent the most money in Cuba, New Mexico at $444.43. This is because this is the town that we left from when the National Forest closed. So we were there for roughly a week. We actually spent some time in Santa Fe, but I just grouped all those costs together. I also went on some REI runs while we were in Santa Fe, so this number is a little bit skewed. I spent the least at Doc Campbell's at just $40. That town stop cost me so little because it was really just a general store in the middle of the National Forest. We camped when we stayed there, and we also sent ourselves a box, so I didn't have to buy a full resupply. I just bought some food at the general store and a few supplemental items. There was definitely enough food to resupply there, but I heard from some other hikers that it was pretty pricey. My highest spending category for New Mexico was gear replacements / additions, and that total came out to $663.84. I think it's pretty common for this category to be pretty high at the beginning of a thru hike. You're still kind of figuring out what gear is working for you, what isn't. Personally, I brought a lot of gear that I already had, so some things just ended up needing to be replaced after so much use. But overall, I would say this category went down by quite a bit in every other state. My lowest spending category for this state was miscellaneous expenses at $201.66. This included my New Mexico land use permit, my Garmin InReach subscription, some runs to the post office, and just a few other odds and ends like that. Notable splurges for this state were my REI trips in Santa Fe. I spent about $200 in a single trip on just shoes and a sleeping bag liner. It is what it is. Notable saves for New Mexico include the fact that my fiance's mom took us to the southern terminus, so we didn't have to pay for a shuttle, which is a huge cost. However, having done that, I would recommend the shuttle. It's a pretty rough road, and without knowing the directions super well, it's easy to get lost. I wouldn't put her through that again. And finally, in case you're curious, here is a quick list of exactly what I spent in each town. And also, here is a list of what I spent in each category. So like I said, in total, the New Mexico section of my CDT thru hike cost $2,489.58. Next up is the state that I've called home for the past several years, Colorado. It's another state over 700 miles. We stopped in 10 towns and we took 9 zeros. I have friends here, okay? And I spent a total of $2,032.38. Colorado is probably the state you're going to hear most people say is the most expensive because of all the touristy mountain towns. And while this is definitely true, there's definitely a lot of them, especially in central Colorado. We had friends here, so it was a lot easier for us to find lodging for a lot cheaper or for no money at all. So keep that in mind when I'm going through my Colorado totals. So let's dive into the dirty details of the $2,032.38 I spent on the CDT in Colorado. I spent the most money in Pagosa Springs. I spent a total of $488.68 in Pagosa. And this is because after our first week of hiking in Colorado, we were super early in the San Juans. We really wanted to give the snow and the wind some time to die down. So we spent 3 whole days in Pagosa, and it's not a cheap town to begin with. So that number is pretty high compared to what you could expect to spend. I spent the least amount of money in Twin Lakes at $83.87. We only intended to partially resupply at Twin Lakes, and so that's part of why this was so cheap. I would also recommend doing that if you're thinking about hiking the CDT. There's food at the general store, but it was pretty slim pickings when we went through. The only reason we even spent more than that is that Kid somehow finagled his way into staying at an Airbnb in town for cash under the table. So it was a really cheap stay, like $25 a person, and overall, we really enjoyed that stop. My highest spending category in Colorado was food and beverage at $737.15, followed closely by resupplies at $469.64. The cheapest way to hike through Colorado maybe would be to just eat less than I did. I don't know. Like I said, I think most people could accidentally spend a lot on lodging in Colorado, so just be really conscious of that as you're going through. There will be some towns where you have no option but to buy a $200 room if you really need a hotel room, so try and keep it cheaper in the other towns where there's more options. My lowest spending category in Colorado was gear replacement at $214.12. This did include new shoes, a new shirt, and a new hat, so really not that bad over 700 miles. For notable splurges in Colorado, we have the 3 days that I spent in Pagosa Springs. Like I said, already not a cheap town, and spending 3 days there certainly wasn't the most frugal decision. However, I think it was really important to the longevity of my thru hike. For notable saves in Colorado, like I said, we had support from family and friends in the state, which was awesome. So we spent a lot less on lodging than I think you realistically might end up spending. We didn't pay at all to stay in Lake City, Breckenridge, Grand Lake, or Steamboat. Some of those were Trail Angels, some of those were friends, but overall that kept costs down quite a bit. Here's a quick list of what I spent on each town in Colorado. And here's a list of what I spent on each category in Colorado. So again, the Colorado section of my CDT thru hike cost $2,032.38. Next up is Wyoming, the shortest section of this trail at just over 500 miles. We stopped in 4 towns, took 3 zeros, and I spent a total of $1,147.58. Like I said, Wyoming is the shortest section of the CDT, and at this point we were also moving, cruising, putting in the miles, so that's part of why this state was so much more affordable. Also, just the general cost of living in Wyoming is obviously a lot lower than somewhere like Colorado. We also chose to send it over a 9-day stretch in the Wind River Range. We could have stopped in town, but we decided not to, so that also reduced our costs. Obviously, the less towns you go into, the less money you spend. I spent the most money by far in Du Bois, and yes, it is pronounced Du Bois. Don't make the mistake that I did and call it Du Bois. I spent $504.04 in that town. If you don't know, Du Bois is a gateway town to Yellowstone, so it's very touristy, and at the height of summer, lodging is sparse and not cheap. We zeroed in Du Bois when we arguably shouldn't have, so a lot of the money I spent there went to lodging, and I also grouped in my Yellowstone Village purchases with the money I spent in Du Bois, so there's a few lunch taps on there that I didn't actually spend in that town. I spent the least amount of money in Riverside/Encampment. They're 2 really small towns right next to each other, right over the Wyoming border, and I only spent $127.47 in this town. Most of my tab in this town was at one of the only 2 restaurants there. And another thing to note about Riverside/Encampment is it was the longest hitch of my life. It took me 3 hours to get into town, so if you value your time, this actually might have been a more expensive stop. My highest spending category in Wyoming was again food and beverage at a total of $405.15. I'll be the first to admit that town food is my biggest weakness. Lowest spending category in Wyoming was, again, miscellaneous at a total of just $102.90. This mostly consisted of post office runs and my Yellowstone permits. Notable splurges in Wyoming, again, staying in town for too long. Staying in Du Bois for 2 nights was definitely more expensive than it needed to be. Notable saves in Wyoming included skipping Pinedale, again, doing that long stretch through the Wind River Range definitely saved us money. And also Josh's parents were kind enough to gift us a hotel stay in Lander. So again, saved us some money on lodging, which was super kind and awesome. Here's a quick list of what I spent in each town in Wyoming. And here's a quick list of what I spent in each category in Wyoming. So again, the Wyoming section of my CDT thru hike cost $1,147.58. Moving on to the final section, we've got Idaho, Idaho/Montana. For us, this section was over 800 miles. We stopped in 9 towns and we took 5 zeros, and I spent a total of $2,212.36. I did include Waterton in Canada in this roundup, and I also think it's worth noting at some point about halfway through, we realized we were moving fast enough to make it to Canada on time, so we decided to start taking zeros in every single town to maximize our time with our trail family and our time on trail. I spent the most money in West Yellowstone at a whopping total of $367.55. West Yellowstone is another touristy gateway to Yellowstone town. We didn't even zero there and it was still really expensive. I did buy 2 resupplies to send ahead, so that did up the cost a little bit, but again, those tourist towns, they're no joke. I spent the least money in Lima, Montana at a whopping total of $85.47. The motel was full when we got there, so we spent $10 to camp, shower, and do laundry. Pretty great deal, if you ask me. We also sent a resupply box here, so we didn't do any resupply in this town, and the $80 that we spent was mostly on food in town and also shuttles to and from trail. My highest spending category in Idaho, Montana is, you guessed it, food and beverage at $812.29. I'm justifying this ginormous number to myself by remembering that this section was 800 miles long, so if you break it down, I kind of only spent like $1 on food per mile. I don't know. I don't think that actually makes it any better. My lowest spending category in Idaho, Montana was gear replacement at just $75.99. I think the only thing I bought was shoes. So shout out to my friend who gives me discounts on Ultras. You're the best. My most notable splurge in Idaho, Montana was deciding to zero in every town after Darby. I thought it was worth every penny. Notable saves in Idaho, Montana included the fact that our trail family was pretty well established at this point, and we split basically every single stay in town with each other. Another huge thing for me was that my mom came and picked me up at the Canadian border, and she helped us a ton with transportation. So thank you, Mom. You're very sweet. I love you. Here's a quick list of what I spent in each town in the Idaho, Montana section. And here's a list of what I spent in each category in the Idaho, Montana section. So again, in conclusion, the Idaho, Montana section of my CDT thru-hike cost $2,212.36. So if you've been doing the math up until now, you already know the total, but in case you haven't, I'll do it for you. Everything together brings my total on-trail cost of a CDT thru-hike in 2022 to $7,881.80. If you divide that on-trail total by the 2,700 miles on the CDT that I hiked, it comes out to about $2.90 per mile. A little bit higher than the dollar per mile number that I would often see when I was researching my first thru-hike, and I think now most people say $2 a mile, but for me, it ended up being more like $3 a mile. I don't know if that's because the CDT goes through a little bit more expensive states or if it's just the way that I hike. When you add my pre-trail expenses like health insurance, car insurance, and obviously very importantly gear to that total, it comes out to $12,854.80 spent on my thru-hike of the CDT. This is how all of the categories broke down by state, and you can see my total there as well. So there you have it. My thru-hike cost roughly $12,854.80, keeping in mind that my on-trail total was just under $8,000, and I did go a little bit expensive on that gear cost estimate. I hope you find my transparency helpful in planning your own thru-hike of the CDT. If you did, go ahead and let me know in the comments or by subscribing so I can keep making content like this in the future and hopefully go on even more hikes and share my numbers from those. Also, if you feel comfortable, I'd love if people could share in the comments how much they spent on their thru-hikes. I think having more numbers is always helpful for people to kind of get a grasp on what they might expect to spend. Obviously, I'm just one person and not reflective of thru-hikers as a whole, so maybe that way we can crowdsource some info. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this jumpstarts your saving for your next thru, and hopefully I'll see you out on trail.